The Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague.
Welcome to the Books Podcast. I'm Tim Hague. Now, over the years, certain themes have emerged in Books Podcast's coverage, and the principal theme has been things that Tim wants to read about, which is why we have economics, pop music, history, and so on, and why we also nibble at the edges of scientific understanding. Now, last time we discussed Mike Jay's rather wonderful book about discovering nitrous oxide. And in this episode, we're talking down the line to MIT Professor of Science Writing, Thomas Levenson.
If you don't have the framework to think a new thought, if you've got an answer that's sufficient in the time, then it's very hard to make progress. You shit your guts out. The disinformation dozen who spread lies so effectively on social media about the COVID vaccine, those are people I really disdain.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
Tom, thank you for joining us on Books Podcast.
It's a great pleasure.
The book is So Very Small, How Humans Discovered Germs, Uncovered Infectious Diseases, and Deluded Themselves that we had conquered them. We start off, of course, with Antony van Leeuwenhoek, who first observes bacteria down a microscope in 1676. 200 years later, we get germ theory. You know where I'm going. Why did it take so long?
Well, that's the
whole book, I know.
All right. The 64,000-pound question, as we rarely say. There are a bunch of reasons why it might have taken so long, and I have a very strong view that one of those reasons is that if you've got an answer that's sufficient in the time, then it's very hard to make progress. And I think that's a big part of what was happening here.
It's a kind of a sclerosis of worldview, of paradigms.
Really what's happening here is the worldview that was at play in 1676, and I would say, as the book goes through in some detail, still in modified form has its hooks into us today, is that human beings are exceptional. And they're exceptional in a very particular way. We are the thinking animal. We've got opposable thumbs. We've got big brains. And in the context of 17th century, 18th century thinking about the world, we have a particular relationship to the divine. God is in heaven, and then there are the angels, and then there are us in a hierarchical order. And below us is all of nature. We exist, and this is where I think the idea really persists, we exist outside of and in dominion over nature. And if you think that, when somebody comes along and says, look at these really cute little animals that I'm seeing through my microscope for the first time, these little bugs that have little legs or are round and they skitter around, aren't they cool? And everybody goes, yeah, they're cool. Interesting, fun, but not consequential.
Not consequential, that's the point, isn't it? Because van Leeuwenhoek has noticed that then these are living things at the microscopic level, but for a long time nobody makes the leap into the impact they're having on humanity, which is, of course, the whole of the book, and you trace it in detail, the various stages that happened.
If you think of what happened 10 years before Leeuwenhoek discovered these microbes, first sites of bacteria, and communicates them to the Royal Society. 10 years before, the Royal Society was acutely aware and mostly got out of town of the Great Plague of London, right? So here's this enormous explosion of an infectious disease about which they know some things, but not others. And this problem of trying to think about stuff if you have a plausible, adequate explanation for what you're seeing. And they did. There was a whole elaborate theory of health and illness and the way disease got communicated. You have the notion of the four humors. This is old Galenic medicine, which was still influential. And disease is some unbalancing of that, some derangement of the balance of your body's workings, which, as a very general statement, is still not a terrible way to describe the experience of being sick. And you have ideas about contagion. Yes, God was the one who visited disease upon you, but on this material earth, in this veil of woe, God does so through material means. And the idea here was that there were miasmas, bad air,
Yeah. That idea persisted very strongly, didn't it? It was very difficult to shift.
Absolutely. And again, that's partly because it was wrong, but it wasn't entirely wrong.
Of course, you also got the problem that some people will get better. So if the doctors are working on these theories, And then some people recover. They'll point to those and say, there, we have had a desirable effect there.
Absolutely. And that happens again and again in the history of medicine, certainly in the history of infectious disease. But the striking thing about the one other thing that I think makes my argument more plausible, that science is not just an automatic machine for you put in an observation and you chunk out a result. It doesn't work that way. And one of the ways you can see that this wasn't simply an obstacle of the difficulty of the problem, the issue of deriving an experiment that would tell you what you should think and so forth, is that there were a tiny handful of people, more as you go through time, who were able to pose at least the question, could microbes be involved in disease, from not instantly, not the moment Leeuwenhoek sent the messages across, but during Leeuwenhoek's lifetime. One of my favorite stories in the book is the story of Cotton Mather, who is this famous, in certain circles, American Puritan divine, who's most notorious for his role in the Salem witch trials, where he was the leading Boston cleric, really saying, go
burn them, burn the witches.
Exactly. This sort of demon-ridden Puritan hothead was also fascinated by sort of all things to do with disease. And so one part of the story is his role in introducing smallpox inoculation, the first sort of kind of vaccine that was in use in the Western world in 1721. But the other thing he did is in his never published enormous book on everything he would think about medicine, all the sort of potions he could find, supposedly curative potions, descriptions of disease, it's just this magpie's catalog of stuff. Tossed in there in 2 or 3 pages is speculation that Leeuwenhoek's, by name, Leeuwenhoek's little animals could be implicated in disease. They're everywhere. We know they're everywhere. And crucially, he made the leap that each different disease could be caused by a distinct different species. And that's in 1721. And that's by this sort of wild-eyed...
But as you point out, and this is one of the themes of the book, Cotton Mather didn't have the sort of intellectual equipment to follow that through to germ theory. No, he could speculate it, and all the way through the book, and we're going to talk about some of the specific diseases, you've got instances where somebody has an insight, but either it's buried, it's in the wrong place, nobody hears about it, and it never then makes it. This is why it's 200 years of following through.
Exactly. It's one of the sort of minor themes of the book is it doesn't matter how smart you are if you publish your results someplace no one reads it. And the same thing happens more than once in the history of germ theory. In particular, there was this Italian guy who worked out the pathogen for cholera, which was one of the great scourges of the 19th century, worldwide, 5 waves of worldwide pandemic. And this guy in the 1850s in Italy worked it out, published it in a local journal in Florence, and got almost no notice for it.
Pacini. You say his name was Pacini, yes?
Yes.
He's doing that at the same time that John Snow is figuring out a response to cholera in London. So if only those two fellows happened to be next-door neighbours, we might have had germ theory 100 years sooner.
At that point, 20 years sooner. That's the 1850s. Germ theory starts to really cook in about 1875 or so, 1876. But crucially, just think about it, the mid-1850s would have put it ahead of the American Civil War, in which 2/3 of the 600,000 to 1 million combatant deaths were deaths of disease or wound infection. And think how many lives could have been saved with a better understanding of what was actually going on in those diseases. There's a slight melancholy to doing history, because every now and then you run into these moments where if only they had known. It's just a few years separate from knowledge that could have saved them, or an invention that could have helped, or something like that. So there's that sort of bittersweet aspect to it. But the interesting thing about John Snow is he didn't know what the material agent that was causing cholera was, but he was able, by working out how the disease had to work, he figured out how to stop the disease.
He worked out the vector.
Yes, it's something in sewage, in waste, that if it gets into the water supply and hence gets into your gut will cause you terrible problems. He worked that out and he said, okay, even though I don't know what is actually moving from the waste to the water to the gut, I know it's there. And if I stop that journey, I can stop the disease. And he was, of course, quite right in that.
And We probably have to quickly adumbrate what happened, what Jon Snow did and where he did it.
Sure. Jon Snow is a doctor in London, up to the point of his great discovery about cholera, more famous for being England's sort of one of the earliest and premier anesthesiologists, even going so far as to knock out Queen Victoria on one occasion. But he was acutely aware of the problem of epidemic cholera. And the third cholera global pandemic hit England in two waves, one in the late 1840s and then again in 1855. Same basic outbreak, but striking ashore in these two separate occurrences. And starting from the first one and then really nailing it in the second one, Snow noticed a pattern that in houses, in neighborhoods that had a discrete water supply, people who would get one source of water might have no cholera in their houses at all, while their neighbors who got their water from somewhere else would have cholera. And he looked at what was happening, what made that difference. And he found that in places where cesspools or sewage drains communicated with the drinking water supply, that was where you found cholera. And in the mid-1850s, there was a bad cholera outbreak in Snow's own neighborhood in London, Soho. And he saw this happening. He recognized that there was a single specific source of the water that the people who were getting ill all seemed to be using, was the pump in Broad Street in Soho. And he traced case after case to people who had gotten their water from there. And he observed that places that did not get their water from that source were, again, not suffering from the disease. So he suggested that the parish leaders remove the handle from the pump, which was done, and the epidemic outbreak in that area rapidly came to a close. What he had done was basically figure out germ theory without germs, without knowing what the specific pathogen was. Just eventually they traced it back to a woman who was changing diapers on her baby just across the street from the pump and washed those diapers, and they were infected with cholera. The child had already somehow picked this up. And that washing these poop-soiled garments, that water got into the water source for the pump. It was very close, and there were leaks in the pipes and so forth. And all this was found fairly shortly after the fact. And that was identified as essentially the index case.
These human stories, of course, are the real power of the book, because it could be terribly rarefied if we just talk about diseases and things. But it's when you get down to the ground and the sheer numbers and the horror of disease before germ theory was able to address it. And I mean, there are, again, another theme is not just the countless numbers of lives that are not saved, but the appalling slaughter from medical interventions. I want to bring up, for me, I thought it was the most distressing, the most terrifying story, which is about puerperal fever. Have I pronounced that? I've only ever seen it written down.
Same. I have no idea. I say puerperal fever, and between us, maybe we'll get somewhere within shouting distance of the right way to say it.
Okay, but tell me about that. What was it, and how did it impact? And in particular, what then was done about it eventually?
It's, as you say, it's a tragic, infuriating story. I don't know if you remember the great Paul Newman film, The Verdict. Anyway, it's a film.
Yes.
It's a film about medical malpractice, and in the crucial scene, this nurse who has observed doctors doing terrible things shouts, "These doctors, these men!" I had exactly that reaction to the story of puerperal fever. These arrogant men condemning thousands upon thousands of women to ugly, painful, and completely preventable deaths.
And of course, more women, because it had been around for centuries, millennia, puerperal fever. But it only becomes the epidemic when you start taking women into hospitals and letting men provide them with medical.
There's a huge social history story that has been covered by better and more assiduous scholars and all that about the importance of the transition in women's health in particular, from basically women healers, midwives, and so forth, providing care, and the switch to the professionalization, the use of the hospital, and the domination of the field by male doctors. So what happens is puerperal fever it's an infection that is often associated with childbirth. Its colloquial name was childbed fever. meaning you'd give birth and then you'd be lying there, and a day or two later you would start showing signs of an acute infection. It's actually, we now know, it can be caused by more than one species of bacterium, but basically it's a bacterial infection. It gets into the bloodstream, it produces systemic effects. Some people do recover from it, but it has a very high fatality rate, and the experience of disease and decline is just pretty horrendous. The question was, where did this come from? Where did these numbers come from? And here again, one of the problems is, back in 18th century Europe, the hospital in Dublin wouldn't necessarily publish its data in a way that the hospital in Vienna would know about it. So it takes a lot of time for people to realize that this is a generalized epidemic problem within the sort of hospital space of giving birth in Europe at the time. But in 1795, a completely obscure doctor in that noted hotbed of advanced medical thinking at the time, Aberdeen, Scotland, starts to notice a pattern in his practice. He's the leading childbirth obstetrics doctor.
This is Alexander Gordon.
Alexander Gordon in Aberdeen. And there are a network of midwives who also deliver babies. And this is a case where it's not so much the hospital setting, it's the fact that there are a handful of professionals attending these births. And he notices that if he attends a woman and she develops puerperal fever, then the next several patients he sees also seemed to develop it in sequence. And the same was true of midwives practicing in the area at the time. And he comes to the correct conclusion that, again, he has no idea what's happening in terms of the specific disease pathology, what the source of it is, and then what it does when it enters the body. He just knows that if he attends somebody who falls ill, then there's a really good chance the next person will also fall ill. He says, the only link is my hands, my person. I'm carrying something from one birth room to the next that produces this harm. And he's correct. He does basically he solves it epidemiologically, even though he has no idea of the microbiology or any of the stuff that we would now think of as part of the story. He publishes his report, and this is another case where nothing really happens, except that the midwives in town get really pissed off that he's implicated them in harm to their patients. And he essentially gets run out of town and then dies of tuberculosis fairly soon thereafter. And this is repeated. Same thing happens when a young doctor in the United States at a medical society meeting hears about this outbreak, puerperal fever, in the greater Boston area, somewhere around Boston. And this guy, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who is the father of a famous Supreme Court justice over here.
And also the man who coined the term anesthesia, I think.
Holmes, who is not, unlike Gordon, is not an OBGYN kind of doctor. He's a young doctor. He doesn't have an extensive practice, and he certainly doesn't deliver a lot of babies. But he goes through the records and sees exactly what Gordon saw. There is this pattern. Clearly, there is something that the physician or the medical person is carrying from room to room in a hospital or in a more distributed practice. And the only way to deal with it is to have a radical cleanliness imposed upon you. You have to really make sure that you are carrying nothing. Change your clothes, really wash your hands, all that between births. And this is where we get back to that sort of theme of human exceptionalism. Because in the beginning, in the 17th and much of the 18th century, that's really expressed primarily in religious terms, the sort of great chain of being. God commands, we obey, but we are granted by God. It's right there in Genesis, dominion over the earth and all the things within it, right? So we're the bosses, we are the actors, not the acted upon. By the 19th century, you get similar ideas of hierarchy expressed in social terms. So the response to Holmes is really from the more established maternal care folks in American medicine, utterly dismissive. And the leading man in that figure, a Philadelphia doctor named Meigs, M-E-I-G-S, I don't know how to pronounce that either, that he literally wrote the textbook of the time on all this stuff. And he dismisses Holmes by saying that his report is the maunderings of a sophomore, and goes on to say that the mechanism that Holmes proposes is impossible because, and I quote, "A gentleman's hands are clean." Again, the arrogance, those men. And that was the problem. And then you get to the climax of the story with the famous story of Ignaz Semmelweis at the Vienna General Hospital and the natural experiment where midwives are delivering babies in one ward at this big Vienna hospital, and medical students and doctors are doing it in the other ward. And the medical training of the day had put a real emphasis on studying the body in close detail. So every person who died on the doctor's service would get dissected in the autopsy room to see what had happened, right? Which meant that medical students and doctors would go down to the morgue, cut open these bodies, look at all these terrible systemic problems that had resulted from their infection, and then go back up to the maternity ward and deliver more babies. What we now know is the entirely expected result. The doctor's ward had this huge rate of puerperal fever, and the midwives' ward, where the women were not trained in that way, they just delivered babies, they weren't educated in the higher realms of medical science, had a much, much lower rate. Semmelweis, who was a young doctor in this service who was brought in the 1840s, saw this, and through a tragedy, his own mentor got cut during an autopsy and got the same fever, got the same disease and died of it. And that was the light bulb that went off. And Semmelweis said, aha, there is something, he called them cadaverous particles. Didn't know what they were, just gave them that label so you wanted it. But cadaverous particles were carried by the doctor from a patient who had died of the disease to the next patient who would then catch the disease and so on. And he said, okay, we can do something about this. And he required, again, he had no mechanistic understanding. He didn't look through the microscope and find the bacteria or anything like this. He just said, something's happening in the morgue. We need to put a chemical wall between the morgue and the childbirth rooms. And the way he did it was he compelled everyone who took part in an autopsy to wash their hands in a chlorine solution until the stench of death was gone. It was just a heuristic. And that turns out to have been long enough to kill the bacteria that again, we now know were there, that were carrying this disease as an epidemic through this delivery service. And again, this worked. It had almost immediate effect. The doctor's ward got the same rate of complications as the midwife's ward. You'd think that's a grand success story. But
You'd think so. But of course, doctors don't like being told that they're responsible for death, do they? So There was quite a lot of resistance to the idea.
There was indeed, including by the sort of senior people in German language medicine, Virchow, the sort of great pathologist and microscopist, who was in many ways the sort of brilliant, humane, what we might now call progressive thinker in medicine and social matters, just dismissed this out of hand. And Semmelweis lost his job in Vienna, went back to his hometown in Budapest. I think Pest itself, on that side of the river. And eventually, as he was trying to persuade the medical world that no, we really can stop killing women, got more and more intemperate and was eventually consigned to an insane asylum, where early on in his stay, he was beaten to the point that he had open cuts, developed an infection, and with this hideous sort of irony, died of an infection produced by the invasion of bacteria into a wound. And it was some decades, there were some people who did pick up on what he said, and some hospitals that instituted more sterile procedures, this use of washing and so forth. But broadly, it took several decades more for the idea that you can create an antiseptic barrier between the bacterium and the next potential victim. And in that interval, again, lots of women died.
We call it an irony that Semmelweis died of infection, but you tell us in 1850, half of all deaths in England and Wales, that you said, and this is also in Germany, half are the result of infection. Yeah. Most people were dying of these pathogens.
Yes, if you go back through history, I mean, there's the terrible slaughter of the innocents, the death of children between 0 and 5 through various infections, often various gut disorders, and the fevers that sort of were generically lumped into this big basket of things. You had this until actually surprisingly late into the 19th century, getting these very high rates of child mortality. Until you get to the end of the 19th century, wound infections are the leading cause of death in war. And then you look at the things that were killing people in the 19th century, these waves of cholera, for example, tuberculosis as this ubiquitous disease of especially the newly crowded urban world of industrializing Europe and America. And you go on through the list. There's typhoid And I realized I was just about to omit the, sort of in some ways the most famous and in many ways the most dreaded of them all, smallpox, which
Well,
was still...
I was going to ask, do you have a favorite is the wrong word. Do you have a candidate for the worst scourge of mankind? Because literally in every chapter, smallpox, cholera, typhus turns up. Whoever's dealing with it goes, this is it. This is the worst thing that can happen to people. And of course, it is if you're dying of that particular one.
If you're in sort of Black Death Europe, then clearly the plague is the only thing that matters. It's killing somewhere between a third and a half of everyone around you. I think I don't have a favorite, but I'm really fast.
I'm asking for a favorite, really. But no, what is
the cholera? The cholera story is so fascinating because it really captures one of the things that I like to drive home in my writing, which is that anything you think of as primarily a science story turns out to reach into all kinds of other domains and questions. And one of the things that's clear about cholera is that it is that the global reach of the disease and the real havoc it wrought across the 19th century are born of empire. And
well, it's because as you tell us, it's really a local disease in Bengal, isn't it? When to begin until the East India Company establishes a base in Calcutta.
Yeah, exactly. Cholera was not a disease that was recognized as significant in Europe or the Americas or even much of the rest of Asia until you start really bringing India into a sort of a more explicitly global system. It does indeed travel on the ships that leave Calcutta and go around the world, carrying it to East Asia, to Africa, to the Mediterranean, and so forth and so on. But also goes overland as people travel on the old Silk Road trails, or you have outbreaks in the course of the century in Russia that then spread into Europe that have come up from the Ganges Valley entirely by an overland route. So it's partly explicitly imperialism and partly the fact that the world gets smaller in the 19th century. There's more contact, there's more travel. Cholera can hitch a ride on a railroad and move from city to city very rapidly, this kind of thing. And that's what makes it such a fascinating study. I think it's the suddenness of the eruption of the disease, in some sense the novelty of the disease, really made it a pressing problem for people to address, I think.
As you say, the plague killed more people, but cholera took people apocalyptically. It would be a matter of hours and you were dead.
Yeah, hours, and your mode of decline and departure was so horrible. You basically, if I can say this on your podcast, you shit your guts out. And you dehydrate, and it's just the linings of your intestines start appearing in your stools as these little particles. There's a phrase, it's the characteristic cholera defecation is a rice water stool. And that's because these sort of particles of your own body appear as these little grains of rice in the outflow.
It's time for a slightly more optimistic note to strike then. So I want you to tell me a little bit about Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur, because that's where we start to find an answer to these problems.
Well, that's right. And eventually, I say there are these obstacles to figuring this out, and there's this worldview, and you can explain disease through these older ideas that don't allow you to do very much, but do give a plausible, descriptive account of what's going on. But eventually, both frustration with the fact that you can't do anything and the accumulation of more and more evidence, like John Snow and his pump handle, and Pasteur's early work on the diseases of beer and wine. Why is it that you can try and ferment something into alcohol and get this horrible, nasty smelling acid flavor that spoils whatever it is you're making? He worked on that in the 1850s and figured it out, identified the bacteria that were causing this sort of deranged fermentation. So eventually the information coalesces and people say, okay, there may be something to this. There's some role that these microbes play in disease. And all that sort of development, slow accumulation of ideas, further observations, the whole sort of ponderous, marvelous wheel of scientific inquiry leads to the point where somebody says, aha, we can nail it. And that somebody in this story it's Robert Koch, the German doctor who, in bout of work over the Christmas period in 1676, gets his hands on the carcass or the hide of an animal that died of anthrax, isolates bacteria from that source, infects rabbits with those, specifically those bacteria, nothing else. They develop anthrax, and he's able to show it continues. He takes the same bacteria from the sick rabbit, gives it to another rabbit, and creates this chain of infection, and ultimately is able to both reconstruct the very curious life cycle of the anthrax bacterium and show how it infects animals and how it can lie dormant for a while in its spore state and come back and infect more animals. He just nails it. He gets the disease perfectly. He identifies the bacterium, and he says, look, there is a living germ, this microbe, that is the specific cause of this particular disease. You don't get the disease without it. You do invariably if you inject animals with it. This is how it works. And from that initial discovery flows a lot more similar findings, including Koch himself finding the cholera bacterium, others identifying the tuberculosis pathogen, typhoid, leprosy. The diseases start rolling in where there's a specific bacterium that is uniquely associated with a specific condition. And there you have germ theory. And what happens from that is all of a sudden, just as with Semmelweis and washing your hands, once you know that there's a specific, clearly identifiable cause of a disease, you can start to take action against it. The first actions that come are really, this is where Pasteur's great contributions come in, are vaccines. Everybody already knows that for many infectious diseases, if you get it once and survive, you don't get it again. And up to that point, that knowledge had only been used successfully to combat smallpox, to create the smallpox vaccine, when people noticed that if you caught cowpox, a related disease of cattle, you would get mildly ill, but you would then not get the smallpox after that. And an English physician named Edward Jenner at the end of the 18th century observed that, saw that, and started inoculating people with cowpox material from pustule sores that people suffering from the disease would display. And that was where the smallpox vaccine was born. But that was for a century, that was the only vaccine. Discovered purely empirically. Again, they didn't know what they were communicating. They didn't know much about immune system. They just knew that for infections, if you caught one and survived, you didn't get it again. And you could induce that effect by using this cowpox stuff. So now you have germ theory, and you have these, you know what you're dealing with. Pasteur pioneered the idea that if you can manipulate a bacterium so that it change it in some way so that it loses its virulence, you could then inject that bacterium back into somebody. They would get infected. They wouldn't get sick because it would, or they wouldn't get badly sick because it lost its virulence. And after that, presumably you would have immunity. And he proved this with his anthrax vaccine, which he developed within a very few years of Koch's discovery. And then in a famous trial, injected it into 20-something sheep and left another 20-something sheep and I think a goat.
One benighted goat.
Yeah, poor fella. And then went back a few days later and exposed them all to anthrax, to live virulent anthrax. And the results were rapid and decisive. The inoculated animals lived and the ones who were unprotected all died in 2-3 days, very quick. And that was the proof of the concept of vaccination. And Pasteur went on to do significantly more work, culminating in his famous rabies vaccine. But this was the first designed intervention with a clearly expressed cause and effect mechanistic explanation for what was going on that allowed humankind to interrupt the disease process. And that's really what makes germ theory important. It's just one thing to say, okay, now we know what causes disease, but that knowledge made a difference.
And of course, it's allowed you and me to grow up in a world in which we can reasonably expect not to die before the age of 5, not to die of a horrible infection if we break our leg or if we need surgery. It's changed all that. Our lives are completely different. And you do a beautiful job on showing that. I want, before we finish, to point out that we're now in this sunny uplands where, tuberculosis, you mentioned, it was curable in 1950, but it still kills 1 million people around the world every year. And that's true of all sorts of things. Smallpox was eradicated in 1980. Others haven't followed. Could we eradicate all the other pathogens as we did with smallpox?
We probably can't eradicate all the other pathogens. One of the things that made smallpox unique is it had no hosts other than humans. So if you got it out of people, it was gone.
I did not know that.
Polio has been on the edge of eradication for a couple, 3 decades now. That was the next disease target. eradication. The only polio in the wild that occurs now occurs in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and in very low double digits per year. Haven't quite been able to eliminate it entirely. And that creates, as more and more kids do not get polio vaccines, that creates a window for the disease to reemerge if it ever breaks its bounds, which is scary. What's happened more broadly is between the antibiotic revolution, which was the next great direct result in some senses of the germ theory revolution, finding compounds that can destroy bacteria in your body without destroying you. Between those two things, plus the addition of good public health, clean water, good air, and all that, infectious disease, at least in the wealthier parts of the world, have become a trivial, almost ignorable cause of death. And what you saw in the 50s, 60s, and 70s was the expansion, in particular, of the vaccination regime for childhood diseases. When I was born in 1958, there were no vaccines for measles or mumps or rubella or pertussis or chickenpox. By 1970, when I was 12, there are vaccines for all those diseases except chickenpox, which was the sort of late outlier. And so now we've had something like half a century where no parent has had to go through that, sit with each of your kids in turn. Well, they went through their measles, they had their mumps.
You say that, but there was a headline in the New York Times on July 9th of this year saying that measles cases have hit a record high. It's 25 years after America eliminated the disease. You must have a real contempt for anti-vaxxers.
Contempt, yes. I have some pity and sympathy for people who are duped by the villains of this piece, the Robert F. Kennedys of the world, the disinformation dozen who spread lies so effectively on social media about the COVID vaccine. Those are people I really disdain. There are people who were duped by Andrew Wakefield, the British doctor, who created this sort of false association between autism and the measles vaccine. But the thing that's happened is, in part because we have so successfully eliminated the burden of infectious disease, the COVID pandemic notwithstanding, sort of the great counterexample. But basically, nobody wakes up thinking, oh my God, my kid's going to get measles. That people are now, I think, losing sight of that and are welcoming infectious diseases back through the back door. Vaccine resistance, vaccine hesitation, combined with the increasing problem of antibiotic resistance, the fact that many of our frontline drugs are no longer effective against a significant...
Well, we overuse them. We give them to animals for growth hormone. And you've got a quote from Alexander Fleming from his 1945 Nobel Prize speech, in which he says, if you're going to use penicillin, use enough of it. Because if you don't, then you induce resistance.
Exactly. And we've done that. We've set up some systems that seem purpose designed to create resistance. And these are, I don't want to be too alarmist. It's not the great plagues are going to descend upon us and wipe us out on the scale of the Black Death or what have you. But we are more at risk than we used to be, and we are creating the potential for much larger problems down the road. Millions of people worldwide per year dead of antibiotic-resistant infections. Already seeing that with tuberculosis.
Is this taking us back to your original theme of mankind thinking it's got an exceptionalism, but it's above all that kind of thing?
I think so. Again, going back to this, we've often used the language of war, the war against microbes, the war against infectious disease, and so forth. And that's a framing that gives us an advantage. After all, we've got brains. Bacteria don't even have nuclei. We've got these lovely hands that can manipulate tools. We can make things. Our technology is overwhelming. Bacteria don't have technology. Well, it turns out they do. They evolve. They respond to changes in the environment.
And they communicate between them as well.
Absolutely. One of the great discoveries in microbial research has been this sort of like almost worldwide web of microbial information that passes between quite different strains of bacteria, these plasmids that float around and encounter different organisms. And it turns out they can evolve just as fast as we can invent. Any presumption that we can brain our way out of our problems has to make allowances for the fact that we are not up against a passive, inert opponent. this is the microbes world as much, or maybe more than it is ours. They respond to what we do. No plan survives first contact with the enemy, as the soldiers say. And we are, I think, if we assume that we have this sort of irreducible advantage over nature, we mistake the fact that we are, in fact, fully embedded in nature. We share our bodies with more microbial cells than human cells, each of us. It's not a world where we have that kind of automatic authority, dominion, that I think we still believe we do. And that's getting us into trouble right now.
Tom, I think you can tell I found the book an absolute page-turner, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you for this conversation. This has been lovely.
So that is Thomas Levenson, So Very Small, How Humans Discovered Germs, Uncovered Infectious Diseases, and Deluded Themselves That We Had Conquered Them, published by Head of Zeus at £25. I really enjoyed it. Tom, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. This has been grand.
That was the Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague. Email Tim on tim@bookspodcast.com, Twitter @bookspodcast, and Facebook @bookspodcasttim.